Okay, so I think we're ready to roll here. First of all, business from last week for the quiz. This beautiful, beautiful mug, Nancy C. Scholes, building the city with the different maps of the different made land, and then on the back, 19th century Boston Common with the water in the background. Oh, it's a really nice one. So something very exciting. I have very little work to do this week. I didn't have to dig up any images of childhood heroes for people to guess numbers, which is also a little bit disappointing because this is the first week where we have one correct answer. So major kudos to Cole Schmidt, who is walking away with this, and he actually he went out and he went to go sort of walk it and check it out himself. So the question was, in 1852, when Mill Dam was widened, and houses started to be constructed on it. Of the first 8 houses constructed on Mill Dam, 2 of them are still standing. And Cole went down. First, he established it was Beacon Street, that Mill Dam was a continuation of Beacon Street, and went down to Beacon and walked it to figure it out. So major kudos. Cole, what's the answer?
Beacon in Arlington.
Beacon in Arlington. That's the answer. And so we have our first single correct answer. One person walking away with it. It was hard. And so major kudos to Cole. We'll figure out when you pick it up. This week, coffee is always better out of a commemorative mug. But this week, it's really nice. So we have an image. It says, focusing is always the challenge. Come on. Nope. There we go. We have an image from chapter 1 that you guys didn't have to read, but it's an image of migrants. I wish I could get that focus because it's really nice. It's an image of a cartoon or a drawing, I guess is the best way. If you cover your face, it'll work better. It's programmed to find your face. Great idea, Jack, but then how will I know? Oh, there you go. Wow, that was pure genius. Thanks, Jack. So it's a drawing or a graphic, I guess a cartoon maybe would be the best way of putting it, of migrants gathering at a port in County Cork with signs in the background for destinations, Boston, New York, Quebec. That's really nice. And on the back, we have, we have an image of the fairly new memorial on Deer Island near the water treatment plant to the Irish, to those who died in the Irish migration, and the over 800 migrants who died on Deer Island and being held on Deer Island. And the I think it's only maybe a year old, this memorial, I think 2019. And I took a picture of it. I wish I could claim this was my picture, but it's actually from the Boston Globe. I consider trademark on mugs to be very loose. But I took a picture when I went down to Deer Island to film the last film. So I thought it went very well together. And we have a really good question. Really good question to ask. Hold on. Commemorative coffee. Okay, so I am really, really excited for our guest this week, Professor Hidetaka Hirota. And there's something great about this. Actually, we have 2 non-Americans, right, who have both lived through the immigration process, right? Professor Hirota returned to Japan to teach, but lived in the United States for a long time, and me. So, you know, two non-Americans who are going to discuss for you migration, 19th century migration to Boston, but also really the resonances to many policies and personal experiences today. And, you know, both of us can actually attest to the fact that some of the issues, right, some of the ways that immigration has been handled, or sort of the ways that immigration was handled beginning in the 19th century, established a framework for the way that people like us experience immigration to the United States today. And we'll talk about it. And I'm a firm believer that in sort of an understanding history, really, you know, outsiders do it best. You know, people who don't have an inside view and who come to a culture and a place and have to learn it and see it very differently, right? Than people who experience it with a different set of assumptions. So it is election day, so I hear. Now, immigration has interestingly not been as big an issue as it was in the last election, and as I think it might have been had it not, you know, had the coronavirus not become such a dominant issue. But it's election day, and we have two non-Americans who have experienced immigration discussing immigration. So I think that's actually sort of cool and exciting. Professor Hirota is an associate professor at Sophia University in Tokyo. He teaches North American studies and migration studies. He lived in Boston for a long time because he did his PhD at Boston College, this very important, if not most important, cultural and educational institution associated with the Irish migration. And then after, he was a Mellon Fellow at the Society of Fellows at Columbia in New York, which is really sort of one of the most prestigious postdocs that you can get in the country. And at the same time, he was teaching at City College in New York, part of CUNY. So his book that you read from, Expelling the Poor, Atlantic Seaboard States and the 19th Century Origins of Immigration Policy, I mean, I can't exaggerate how much it sort of revised or reinterpreted how we see the origins of migration policy in the United States, and especially to push it backwards, right? To push the continuities backwards, right? To not see, you know, migration restrictions only emerging with restrictions against the Chinese in the 1870s, or the Japanese later, or Europeans later in the 1920s, but actually sourcing much of these restrictions into earlier, much earlier policies, going back to the colonial period. So we'll talk about it. So this was a major revision. It won an absolute raft of awards. I'll just mention one, as is my way to highlight one. It won the Lewis P. Rudnick Award from the New England American Studies Association, very prestigious award. And also, what's great about Professor Hirota is that he's a public intellectual too. He really values public engagement and contributes a lot both to the Washington Post and the Irish Times. I assigned one piece from Washington Post for you, but you know, I recommend also reading further the stuff that he's done. So without further ado, and we thank him very much because clearly he's using a background right now with the sun shining in because it's currently 10:30 in Tokyo, 10:30 at night in Tokyo. And like me, he has 3 young children. So he's tired and he needs his sleep, but he's here with us anyway. So I really appreciate it. And we're going to have a dialogue here, and I'm going to ask him questions, and you guys can chime in with questions, and I'll moderate the chat as always, and we can ask questions at the end. But first, before we get started, because I think the students would be interested in the story here, if Professor Hirota, you could tell us a little bit about how you came to the topic, and give us a sort of introduction to the book, and how you came to write the book.
Sure, but first of all, yeah, good morning to everyone. Thanks for having me. And yeah, thank you, Professor Radonovich, for inviting me to this very interesting course. As Professor Radonovich said, it's 10:30 p.m. Here in Tokyo, and earlier today we had I had my daughter's like 1 year birthday party. And it's been an intense day. So, but I physically I'm tired, but I'm very excited to be here. And just listening to the earlier conversation, and then listening to hearing some of the keywords like North End, West End, Deer Island, all these kind of things provoke nostalgic feelings, about Boston. I spent 8 years in Boston, and I left the city in 2013. Of course, I had chances, opportunities to go back to the city for a while, occasionally, but still, it's a city I have a very strong sense of attachment to.
That was my goal, to provoke nostalgia.
Right, thank you. You did it, and I kind of envy you guys. You guys are there, and anyway. So thank you again for having me, and let me just talk about the book, portions of which you read or you will read. So this was originally, the book was originally my PhD dissertation, which I wrote at Boston College. So it's my first major scholarly work. And apparently, I guess the question is, why did you pick up this topic, as a Japanese person? I'm a Japanese national. I did my undergraduate work in Japan, and I went to Boston basically for my professional training, for my graduate education. So I guess I can start with my intellectual trajectory here. There's nothing really dramatic. And I guess I should confess that ignorance was definitely a big part of it. Apparently, I had no family members related to Irish and Ireland, and but as an undergrad at Tokyo, I was already interested in American studies, American history, and then I guess what's interesting for me, I guess, is that if you just grew up in Japan, and if you're a college student in Japan, you will be surrounded by so many specialists in Asian migration, like in Japanese immigration, Japanese migration, Asian American studies. So my intellectual background was pretty much opposite to many of the students in the United States. What I'm trying to say here is that if you're in the U.S., you will be aware of the neglect of Asian American experiences, or Latinx experiences, Black experiences, right? After all, that's the kind of foundation for the rise of Asian American studies and Latina studies. But then my situation was completely opposite. There were so many Japanese migration scholars, and I thought that Asian studies, Asian American studies is just overdone. And I just wondered, we don't know much about European migration, and that was not the case in the U.S., but that was my case. So as an American studies major, I became interested in something I rarely had heard of. And then I became interested in issues of slavery first, and then the Civil War era became became my first, serious intellectual interest. And then as I study about the Civil War, I came across this issue of nativism, ethnic tension between Anglo-Americans and the Irish migrants in the mid-19th century, and that kind of captured my particular attention. So and that's the initial interest, like my I think entry point into this subject, right? In the Irish migration in the 19th century, and I guess the academic atmosphere in my graduate work mattered. As Professor Rabinovich said, I went to Boston College, which is heavily Irish. I mean, not today so much, but which has a very strong Irish heritage, I guess. And I had a lot of colleagues, friends in graduate programs who are interested in Irish migration, Irish studies, Irish American history, and that kind of facilitated my further, study in this subject. So that's the kind of entry point into this subject. And I can say more, but I guess I should stop here.
No, that's perfect. It's really fascinating, and I mean, I think it's really good to get this sort of perspective of how people come to study different topics. And like I said, I mean, I think that that the way that you approached it is with a different set of eyes than an American historian would. Probably similarly to a lot of the insights that American or British or Canadian or French or not necessarily Anglo, but other scholars have towards Japanese history or Asian history. It's one brings things a different set of assumptions for sure. So it's really fascinating, and on its own, the Irish migration is a fascinating topic. So one good place to start, I think, might be to talk a little bit, to familiarize the students a bit about what the conditions were in Ireland during the peak period of migration, right? Migration begins with not just with people coming to a place, but people leaving a place. And I think few people know about this concept of assisted migration, right? And so I thought maybe you could say a few words about the conditions of Ireland and about assisted migration and how that comes to be an issue.
Of course, yes. So just for those of you who haven't had a chance to read, do the reading, the book is about.
Well, that's none of them. That's none of them. They've all done the reading. They're my students.
All right, great. But
you can still fill them in. That's all right.
That's a reminder, I guess, a refreshing point, right? Refresher, right?
Still feel free to fill them in.
So the book is about anti-Irish sentiment, or what I call nativism, anti-Irish sentiment in mid-19th century northeastern states like New York and Massachusetts in particular, and how that sentiment, anti-Irish sentiment, was translated into restrictive immigration laws, state-level immigration laws against Irish migrants. And ultimately, the book traces how this state-level immigration policy against the Irish laid the foundations for federal U.S. immigration policies up to this point, right? So it's a work in the history of Irish migration. It's a work in the history of American nativism, and it's a history. It's a work in history of American immigration policy. So the starting place for this study is apparently to understand, what kinds of people came to the United States from Ireland, and what made these people decide to leave home, right? So and to understand this, we have to know what was going on in Ireland in the 19th century, especially for the first half of the 19th century, right? So let me just quickly say this. In the 19th century, by the early 19th century, Ireland had become a colony of Britain. It was part of the British Empire. Ireland was colonized by Britain, And the vast majority of the Irish were Catholics, whereas Britain was Protestant country. So it was essentially Catholic Ireland was colonized by Protestant Britain. And one of the just along the history short, one of the major consequences of this British colonialism was a serious impoverishment of the Irish population. The Irish people became super poor. European peasants were poor in general in the 19th century, but then Irish poverty was just outstanding. It was much more. The poverty level was much higher, even from the European standard back then. So that's the one social economic situation. And under these circumstances, the potato, became kind of almost exclusive food supply, food stuff available for those Irish people. Irish people raised some other crops, but then all those things were exported for British consumption, not for their own consumption. So the potato emerged as a really kind of only food crop available for them. Now the question is, what would happen if the supply of the potato was disrupted, right? Given that Irish people's reliance on the potato. And this food disruption was exactly what happened in the 1840s when the potato blight hit Ireland. So while people relied on the potato for their nutrition or even survival, this crop was devastated by the disease, potato disease. And then essentially the British government mishandled, just like the Trump administration mishandled the coronavirus. The British government, should be responsible. It was supposed to do something for the Irish, but then essentially the British government didn't do anything meaningful. So the result was a massive population loss. So out of 8.5 million in Ireland during the 1840s, over 1 million people died. Between 1 million and 1.5 million died out of starvation, malnutrition, or famine-related diseases, right? And then about 2 million people, more than 2 million people left Ireland in search of better life, or it's actually not simply better life, essentially in search of survival. It was clear that if you stay in Ireland, you would die out of starvation. So one of the consequences of this so-called potato famine, Irish potato famine, was that Ireland lost more than 1/3 of its population. So out of this, we can say a few things about the nature of Irish migrants. Oh, I should say, North America became the major destination for these Irish immigrants, Irish people who decided to leave during the famine during the 1840s. Canada, and then much more importantly, the United States became the major destination for these. Some other went to Australia and New Zealand as well, and a smaller number of Irish also went to Britain. It was the closest destination, right? So again, out of this, we can say a few things about the characters of Irish migrants. One is they were Catholics. Second, they were exceptionally impoverished, right? And they tended to be laborers, unskilled laborers. They were landless peasants in Ireland, so they didn't have many skills, farming skills. They didn't have, of course, capital. They were impoverished. They didn't have. They were penniless, literally. So by contrast, German migrants, who were other major migrant group at that time, Germans tended to have more like farming skills, for example. But then, by contrast, Irish were much more likely to be skillless. So manual laborers or servants, or the domestic servants, were the kind of the occupations for those migrants. So these are the kind of major characteristics. of Irish migrants who went to the United States in the mid-19th century. Now, I should mention one thing before I stop, which is something mentioned by Professor Rabinovich. Overall, even though these Irish were exceptionally impoverished, most Irish people were not from the lowest class, in a sense that they were at least able to finance their passage, right? They were at least, purchase ship tickets to cross Atlantic and then went to to go to North America, right? So in this sense, they were not the poorest, but there were the poorest of the poor among the Irish migrants in the 19th century, and they were called assisted migrants, assisted emigrants. Assisted emigration is a practice done by local landlords or officials at charitable institutions like poor houses or work houses. So at these institutions, these are charitable institutions to accommodate, people who became paupers. That is people who were not able to support themselves by themselves. So they depended on public charity, and they were the poorest in Ireland, and assisted migration was it's a practice adapted by local landlords or local charitable institution officials of sponsoring the migration of these poor tenants, the poorest tenants, or the inmates in almshouses, right? So two observations can be made about this. One, assisted migrants were the poorest of the poor in Ireland, and they were among the Irish migrants in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century to North America. So New York and Massachusetts, for example, or in particular, received those migrants, so they were very poor, exceptionally and extremely poor. Second, why did local landlords in Ireland or charitable institutions do this? And the answer was finance. So the calculation they did was that it's cheaper to pay a one-time passage for those people to North America than to keep them for a long time, for an extended period of time, or to keep them for their lifetime, right? So keeping paupers, keeping destitute tenants will be really expensive. So even though shipping passage was not cheap at all, it was still cheaper, right? Than to keep them for a long time. So that's assisted immigration. And then one final thing is that what's interesting and important is Americans' perception of this, and it's really relevant to today. So a few things can be said about this. So Americans were enraged by the practice of assisted immigration. So the Americans were enraged because those are the people who were destined to become public charges on day one, right? On their arrival, at the very moment they landed in America, they would go straight to the local charitable institutions. So Americans were enraged because they believed that the British government or Irish landlords, Irish charitable institutions were conspiring, to burden America with their own poor, right? That's one important observation. So in other words, assisted immigration significantly contributed to anti-Irish sentiment in America. And then if Professor Rabinovich, if you can just show the cover of my book, cover image of my book. I think
now I know that I have to put my head out of the way so it focuses.
So yes, thank you so much. So if you just see my book cover, you see there's a poorhouse on the ship, right? So the implication here is that a ship is carrying an entire poorhouse. At the top of the house is called poorhouse from Galway. Galway is one of the counties in Ireland. So Americans, that image really captures how Americans thought about the practice. The whole institution is being transported from Ireland to the United States.
As you point out in your book, though, also that there was assisted emigration from England and from Germany as well, but all the focus seems to be on Ireland, right?
Exactly. Yes. German, landlords in German-speaking, states, England and also Switzerland, did similar practices, and also not just paupers but also criminals were sent in this practice, right? But in any case, Americans were very, enraged by this practice. The second importance is that again, just like today, anti-Irish or Native Americans imagined that all the Irish were assisted immigrants, just like all the Mexican immigrants were seen as undocumented immigrants by hardcore immigrants, right? So this kind of overgeneralization, right? Remember, when Trump was a candidate in 2015, he basically said that all the Mexicans were other criminals, rapists, and drug traffickers, right? So this kind of overgeneralization happened against the Irish back then. Even though assisted immigrants were really a tiny portion of Irish migrants, proportionally speaking, but then natives thought that assisted immigration was the dominant form of immigration for the Irish. I guess I stop here.
No, that's perfect. That's just a wonderful setup. And I guess the flip side of that question is, what kind of conditions were the Irish arriving to take Boston as an example, although it could be anywhere. In fact, I found it interesting in your book, as you talked about that even though Quebec was a major destination in Canada, or what was British North America at the time, most people who came to Quebec actually left and emigrated to Boston or New York from there. So what were the conditions in Boston that made it an attractive destination to come to?
That's a very important question, and it's actually difficult. It's actually difficult to imagine Irish migrants feeling, because Boston was the worst choice for the Irish in terms of cultural or cultural ethnic kind of atmosphere of this of the city. So in Boston,
it seems like a bad match. Yeah.
Bad match. And as you should have studied at this point, Boston was traditionally a Puritan city. It emerged as a Puritan colony, right? Unlike places like New York, which had a more cosmopolitan background,
and Quebec, which was Catholic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. New York. So Boston had a very strong Puritan tradition, and Puritan tradition means anti-Catholic. Really, very strong anti-Catholic, and a lot of Bostonians were of Anglo descent. That is, English settlers. Puritans were the ancestors for many Bostonians back then, and of course, those Bostonians inherited, anti-Irish prejudice of their ancestors. Again, English people back then, in 18th century, 17th, 18th century, had a very strong anti-Celtic, anti-Irish ethnic culture prejudice, and many Bostonians inherited this cultural ethnic prejudice against the Irish. So, religiously and culturally speaking, Boston was a really Protestant, especially Puritan Anglo city, which had a traditional hostile sentiment against the Irish. So it's so ironic. It's this is the historical irony here is that Irish migrants picked up Boston, right? Given this kind of cultural backgrounds of the city. Now, I guess the reason why that many Irish nevertheless ended up going to Boston was economic, essentially. As Professor Rabinovich said, many Irish first landed in Canada. The reason why they tend to go to Canada was, again, it's economic. Canada was part of British Empire back then, so the UK Canada passage was cheaper than London, New York, for example, or Liverpool, New York passage, at least during the 1840s. So the poorest ones went to Canada, but then they realized that Canada was just too freezing. I mean, honestly, Canada was just too freezing.
I
and
fully
then
respect that. I could not agree more.
Yeah, and then the economy in Canada was not all good. So in search of better life, in search of better employment opportunities, Irish migrants just continued their trip southwards. They went to Maine, but then Boston was the major city in 19th century America, in the northeastern United States. So and in Boston as a major city, Irish migrants can find employment as manual laborers. So it was a bad match, definitely, and Irish definitely suffered the consequence of their choice. But after all, I think the economy matters. The survival was the most important thing. So that's the context of Irish migration to Boston.
And what were they arriving to? What was the social and cultural milieu that they were arriving to? Just pure hostility, or some sympathy, or
hostility, I guess, was the dominant response that Irish encountered from Bostonians, right? Religion was big. Catholicism was the major source of antagonism against the Irish. So and even before the famine during famine of the 1840s, Boston had already cultivated for a very strong anti-Catholic tradition, and in fact, as early as the 1830s, right, before the time of Irish, famine migration, there was burning of Catholic institution in the city, like Charlestown.
Yeah, the Ursuline monastery. I took some students to Charlestown, and we did a tour. It's on the website, and I mentioned that the burning of the Ursuline monastery by Protestant mobs, and that was even before the major migration, right? Wasn't that 1834 or something like that?
34, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that's before the family migrations. But actually, Catholic migration from Ireland increased since the 1830s. So and then the famine migration decidedly kind of solidified this tendency. Yeah, so the Catholicism, or the religion, was a major source of nativism against the Irish. So as soon as Irish arrived in Boston, yes, they encountered hostility from Anglo-Americans, Anglo-Bostonians, and then again, ethnically, culturally, Bostonians looked down upon the Irish, as inferior people. Irish were white. There was no doubt that Irish were seen as white, and they had white privileges that Black Americans did not have. Nevertheless, Irish did suffer discrimination and daily harassments. And then economics mattered. The poverty aggravated anti-Irish sentiment. So the North End, became the major slum neighborhood in mid 19th century Boston, and middle class and Bostonians, Anglo Bostonians, despised those Irish migrants, who became the residents in North End. So yeah, so I should say that there is a tiny Irish community, and it was growing, but nevertheless, it was not strong enough to cover all these Irish migrants in large numbers. But by contrast, the hostile forces were really big. Speak up.
Whoops. It's Tuesday is garbage day in West Roxbury. They do the trash pickup, so that's why I keep myself muted until until I'm going to speak. Yeah, and a couple of things that really fascinated me about your book that tie into this. One is the sort of challenge of the myth of open borders, right? I think most people believe in this myth of open borders, the idea that the United States had open borders until the first restrictions in the 1870s and 1880s against people coming from Asia. And then and some people aren't even aware of those and are only aware of the sort of comprehensive migration restrictions against Eastern and Southern Europeans and in particular Jews in the 1920s. But you challenge this and have done also in the press as well, for us to not think about borders being open really ever in the United States. And you source the laws, the evolution of the laws and restrictions within the laws to attitudes toward the poor and poor laws that go back to England and evolve from the colonial period, and that there's a continuity, really from colonial England up to the current day on restrictions, and this all has to do with poor laws and attitudes towards the poor. So I thought maybe you could give us a little bit of an overview of that sort of evolution, so the students understand that there really was no period of open migration to the United States.
Right. Thank you. So that's a core of this book. We're getting into really the heart of the book. So if my book does or accomplishes anything, that is to revise our historical understanding, our understanding of the history of American immigration policy, especially the origins of immigration restriction or control in the United States. And especially, yeah, essentially the book is about the origins of American immigration control, where the policy came from. And I don't know how you guys, have understood this history up to today, but the origins of American immigration control. This is a really hotly debated topic among U.S. historians, and people have different interpretations of history, and people have different opinions about this, the origins of U.S. immigration policy. But dominant one has been that the Chinese exclusion laws, which Congress passed mostly in 1880s. The first one was in 1875, but essentially the 1880 laws, federal laws, which restricted the immigration of Chinese workers. Those laws were considered the beginning of immigration control in the United States. And the implication is that before Chinese exclusion, before the introduction of Chinese exclusion in 1870s and 80s, there was no law regulating immigration to the United States. In other words, U.S. had open borders before them. And I challenged that. And I said there was no point in U.S. history when borders were open, completely open. And yes, borders were open in terms of federal immigration control, but the absence of federal immigration control did not mean the absence of immigration control itself. And I'm saying that in the book, I demonstrated in the book that how state governments administered immigration control, regulated immigration with their own laws, and especially New York and Massachusetts, and Massachusetts in the harshest ways regulated, restricted immigration, especially the immigration of the poor, like paupers, people who are not financially support themselves, and especially this law, anti-pauper immigration laws, developed precisely in response to Irish immigration in the 19th century, right? But then, as Professor Rabinovich said, these state laws didn't, suddenly emerge in Massachusetts when Irish migrated. There were some legal precedents or legal structures that dated back to the colonial period. So the very origins of those state laws were English poor laws, that is the laws regulating the movement of the poor in England. So in 17th century England, each community each community was legally authorized to banish like transient beggars, like beggars and people, beggars coming from other communities, like other towns, right? So that's a kind of early that's a form of deportation law, right? And this poor law was introduced to colonial Massachusetts, and then eventually this became the foundation for state passenger laws or state immigration law against the poor, and which was developed in response to Irish migration in the 19th century. And then the trajectory goes, these state laws in New York and Massachusetts became the basis of the first federal immigration law introduced in 1880s. So the first federal immigration law, besides Chinese exclusion, excluded paupers, the mentally ill, and the criminals. And those laws, federal laws, were modeled on Massachusetts laws, right? And New York laws. And essentially the rest of the subsequent federal U.S. national immigration laws were essentially the modified version of these state laws. And the difference is that the category of excludable and deportable people expanded. So originally, it was paupers and criminals, mentally ill. But then it was, added to this category were people with contagious diseases, or anarchists, so the essentially.
We're going to hear about anarchists next week. We have Temkins coming to talk about Sacco and Vanzetti. But
right, exactly. So the category expanded, right? So that's a kind of legal kind of continuity from state to later federal laws. And then I guess there's another kind of important continuity from state laws, state regulation to federal laws. That is the nature of law enforcement. So what I'm mentioning, referring to is the way laws were implemented. So so today we hear lots of stories about ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, how their agents raided the immigrant communities, kidnapped some of the migrants, separated their families, right? Like those radical enforcements. Exactly the same things were done by Massachusetts officials against the Irish. The officers raided not necessarily communities, but then charitable institutions like Boston Alms Houses. Where Irish migrants were accommodated. They raided those institutions and then illegally kind of kidnapped some of the inmates and shipped them away to Ireland. And native-born children of Irish migrants, that is U.S. citizen children, were deported against the deported to Ireland. Naturalized citizens became targets of deportation. And the mentally ill, people who have mental illness, were also deported by those immigration agents. And so the law enforcement really was really radical and harsh, and those practices were definitely inherited in later periods when the federal government, started to regulate immigration. So that's a kind of major continuity. And one last thing is that the public charge clause was not a dead law, and it is so more or less a remarkable revival in 2018 when the Trump administration said that they will expand the public charge clause in immigration law. So the new regulation said if the children of immigrant parents, U.S.-born children of immigrant parents, used food stamps, for example, that would make the entire family likely to become public charges, become a public charge. So earlier, public charge meant that the migrants were like paupers, people who were actually accommodated at charitable institutions. But then the new proposal, regulation, new rule really expanded the whole definition of public charge. If you use
new being 2018, you're talking about.
Yes, 2018. If immigrants and their families use public benefits, various public benefits, the entire family would be considered likely to become a public charge. So historians responded, and many people responded, opposed this new regulation, and then it is still being contested at federal courts. And in fact, this morning, your morning, like several hours ago, I guess a few hours, no, it's not this morning, right? I saw it in a morning newspaper. So I think that decision was made made yesterday. But then, yeah, in this morning, in your time, New York Times featured an article which said that one federal court essentially said that you can't do this to the federal to the Transport Administration. It's beyond executive power, right?
Right, and these are, as you mentioned, I mean, these are benefits that are we don't consider somebody a public charge because they are using federal benefits, right? For example, if you lose your job and you go on unemployment, that's not considered. We don't consider that to be.
And actually, this new regulation was not unrelated to the pandemic. So what happened after the introduction of or the proposal of this new policy was that immigrants hesitated to receive vaccination, right? Because the use of, medical service could be considered evidence of their public charge status. So in terms of public health, this new policy was tremendously dangerous. What happened? People stopped doing vaccination. When they were necessary, right? Vaccination is not entirely connected to the pandemic itself, the current pandemic, but then this, from the larger perspective, as you can imagine, right? The new policy was really dangerous and troublesome.
And when the quarantine station was built on Deer Island, which later became an almshouse, right? People were being kept there. There was a similar sort of perception of an association with poverty and sickness or disease, right? That was not necessarily the case, right? I mean, from my understanding and from even this memorial, people were quarantined who were not sick, but they were poor and hungry. But the city was essentially trying to trap them out on Deer Island in this quarantine station.
Right. And I want to also add that the state of Massachusetts established 4 state almshouses, whereas there were many like town arms houses, like local arms houses. There are 4 institutions like Tewksbury, I forgot the 3 other, Northampton.
And one of them was
yeah,
the Deer Island one, right?
the island was
Was it not
yes,
there?
an additional one.
Yeah.
Besides their island, there were 4 others.
Which they ended up turning into a prison, which was logical enough, right?
Right. Then the original purpose was those state arms houses as opposed to local arms houses is to distinguish deportable immigrant paupers from local, like American paupers. So the American paupers will be accommodated at local arms houses, whereas the deportable foreign-born, like Irish paupers, were sent to state arms houses. And what's important here is that, so in practice, state arms houses were essentially detention centers for those people who were deportable at any moment, right? So, I guess that this is one of the origins of our, your present, detention system.
And one of the things, that I, to emphasize to the students, it's in the book, but really sort of astonished me, is to the extent to which Massachusetts deported citizens. I mean, they really had no even regard for the idea of naturalization, that somebody who was Irish and poor was considered Irish and poor regardless of whether they naturalized. So that the Massachusetts immigration agents were illegally taking the law into their own hand and illegally deporting many citizens and children of citizens falsely on this public charge claim.
Yeah. So what's important, regarding the citizen deportation here is that we're talking about before the age of 14th Amendment, before the introduction of 14th Amendment, right? So for the first 100 years in its history, the United States had no constitutional definitions of U.S. national citizenship. People basically vaguely assume that if you're born in the U.S., that would make you a citizen, right? So the point here is that without the constitutional definition of citizenship was so fragile and it was so easy to violate, right? And citizenship was never a marker of people's rights and liberties. Definitely was not like today, right? 14th Amendment is in many ways considered a really protect a major safeguard for people. Of course, there are many important exceptions here, but still, there was a constitutional definition here. But then, I'm talking about 1850s, which is before the introduction of the 14th Amendment in 1868. And in this time period, for example, poverty, like financial, economic conditions, or ethnicity, or religion, I guess, even, were considered even more important markers of people's rights and liberties. So under these intellectual, kind of cultural, legal settings, it was so easy for state agents to simply just kidnap and then deport even citizens. So the project kind of, the book kind of illuminates what citizenship meant in America before the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, which is a really key point, and that the protections that it came to offer with the definition of citizenship, although of course, the it didn't necessarily protect protect immigrants, right? The arbitrary power of immigration officials and the association between immigration officials and law enforcement is something that continues today and that we have experienced, right? I mean, we are, of course, the way that we have experienced it has been in, the most, I suppose, as almost a form of inconvenience, right? We haven't, I haven't really suffered from it, and maybe you haven't suffered from it the way people who are associated as poor migrants would. However, you are reminded by officials and by border agents frequently as an immigrant to the country about your lack of rights, about the fact that your major concern should be, as I was sitting in secondary processing about to miss my flight once, and I was stupid enough to mention this to somebody. Secondary processing is where they send people after you go through that sort of initial passport control. And I should say in Toronto is an entry, is a point of entry into the United States. So you can go through it in Toronto at the airport. And I got sent to secondary processing, and I was going to miss my flight, and mentioned that, and the agent said, your main concern right now should be whether or not you can come into the country. In other words, that's as minor compared to whether or not we'll let you in. But this is a reminder essentially of their arbitrary powers, their powers of interpretation to the law that they don't tend to understand very well. And to remind you of your relative lack of rights, even though, all over the past place, they've at least now plastered what your rights are in the form of posters, but the officials themselves will remind you that you don't have them. And a lot of this, I think, also has to do with the fact that these are law enforcement officials, right? I mean, in Canada, in the European Union, and I don't know about Japan, but the people who process these things are essentially civil servants, and the law enforcement is done by a different group. These agents still see themselves as law enforcement officials with that sort of power, arbitrary power to interpret the law, which, Professor Hirota, you point out the sort of long history of really, we have Massachusetts to blame for it mainly.
Yeah, so the officials' discretionary power is enormous, but think about this in the first place. How would you define likelihood, right? Like likely to become a public charge. How would you define somebody's likelihood? Of course, you can judge based on people's appearance, and I think that's a major way in the 19th century to determine people's likelihood. But then, given the intense ethnic prejudice or cultural bias against the Irish, some casual behaviors could lead to, the decision, right, as likely to become public charge. So the pro law, the passenger laws based on the pro law gave a really enormous and formidable discretionary power to inspecting officers. And this was really inherited by in later periods inherited in later federal immigration control. So at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 20th century, as Professor Rabinovich said, there are lots of Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants coming to the U.S., and their arrival, provoked a very intense nativist sentiment that, once again, the xenophobic response from Americans. And officers really use this likely to become a public charge clause in federal immigration law really broadly. So that they can maximize, the officers could maximize the number of deportable people, excludable people. And I'm talking about New York here, but then in the other side of the continent, in the Pacific Northwest, for example, the target was Asian migrants. And then once again, the public charge law was interpreted with tremendous discretionary power. So I just give you an example here. So there was a Japanese migrant arriving in Seattle, and under the regulation in the early 20th century, you can pass the examination, the entrance exam, arrival inspection, if you have $30 in cash. The $30 in cash was considered kind of sufficient to keep this migrant like self-sufficient, right? Self-supportive. So this Japanese migrant had the money, $30, which should have allowed him, which should have let him in. But then officers said, "All right, you have $30, and we're going from Seattle to San Fran. We're going to from Seattle, San Francisco. All right, your $30 will be spent on the transportation to San Francisco. So by the time you got to San Francisco, you'll be penniless. You're out, right? So so on this ground, this immigrant was considered likely to become a public charge, and he was excluded. So the the pro law based passenger law really created massive space for administrative discretion. And then in this framework, as Professor Rabinovich said, migrants can be really rightless in many ways.
Which was the intention, right?
The intention, yes.
Yeah.
That's the whole point.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to shift gears for a second, I find it really interesting what the profile was of a nativist or a know-nothing, or different categories of people who resisted Irish immigration to Boston and to Massachusetts in particular. So I thought maybe you could say a few words about about sort of what an activist who opposed Irish immigration, would have looked like in the mid-19th century in Boston.
Yeah, so the nativists, anti-Irish activists, they were really diverse people. Activists were a real diverse group. They certainly included working class, but it's not simply working class movement. Nativists did include professionals, including doctors, like lawyers, and well, I think the common ground is, I guess, most of them were Protestant, right? And then of Anglo descent. But what's particularly interesting in Massachusetts case, in the case of Massachusetts, is that many of the nativists were at the same time abolitionists, or at least anti-slavery activists. So they expressed a remarkable kind of sympathy, I guess, or at least willingness to fight against slavery. And as part of this anti-slavery commitment, many of those nativist abolitionists or anti-slavery activists protected fugitive slaves running away from the South into Massachusetts. And they protected fugitive slaves from forcible deportation back to the South. But in the meanwhile, in the meantime, the same activists promoted the deportation of Irish paupers back to Ireland. So there was interesting dualism between racial progressivism, I guess. I mean, if it's I'm not sure if it's the best word to describe the situation, but on one hand, that is this, and there's this, and on the other hand, there was very strong nativist intolerance. So you see interesting kind of double standards of personal liberty in Massachusetts. And I guess I should mention know nothings. Know nothings were the xenophobic nativist politicians, who became spectacularly popular in American politics during the 1840s, and Massachusetts was the strongest hold of these politicians, know nothings. American Party captured governorship, mayor's office, and almost all seats in the state government, state legislature, except 3 or 4, I think. So it's overwhelmingly nativist regime, and what's interesting in light of what's happening today is the way the know nothings kind of sold themselves to the public. They essentially kind of introduced themselves to political outsiders. So at that time, American two-party system consisted of Whigs and Democrats, right, and later Republicans. And Bostonians or people in Massachusetts were really tired of both parties' inabilities to solve the issues of issues of slavery and also immigration. And then here are know nothings who said, hey, we are political outsiders. Whigs, Democrats were kind of useless. We can do something new and better, right? And people were attracted by this kind of strategy.
They know nothing.
Exactly. The Massachusetts know nothings were committed to anti-slavery, and they said, while promoting nativism, we'll solve the issues of slavery, which could not be done by Whigs and Democrats. So this is really similar to what Trump did. He presented himself as political outsider, and that's the kind of source of his popularity, right? So that's an interesting parallel between now and then.
It's a really fascinating conjuncture of issues, and it's sort of the lead into my next question, which is really, why, and I think part of the answer is the focus on abolitionism, but within the sort of historical or popular memory within the state, but why you think that that Massachusetts' central role in the development of restrictionist immigration policy and this sort of deeply anti-immigration public sentiment that was translated into a political movement here, why this has been so forgotten within Massachusetts, within the within sort of the collective identity. And I know it hasn't been forgotten by historians, of course, but we could ask the students. I'm curious if the students who grew up in Massachusetts, and there's a good number, probably about half. I mean, did any of you were any of you aware at all of the sort of central role of Massachusetts in resisting immigration, or this sort of? See, I'm going to take. I'm assume that the answer is no, because they would say so. I think even more so than the lack of knowledge of slavery, right? I did a poll. I won't create a poll now, but when your colleague from graduate school, Jared Hardesty, joined us from Western Washington, he's several hours behind. So I started, which is less convenient than several hours ahead, although we're already keeping you up to 11:30. But I started with a poll about sort of people's public knowledge of Boston's role in the slave trade and slavery. And it was actually, people were more knowledgeable than I thought. I mean, at least, this according to this anonymous poll, about the most popular answer with people who were aware of Boston's role in the slave trade and that there was slavery in Boston. And I would think, if I put together a poll now, it would be much lower for relating to immigration restrictions. So I'm just curious on what your thought is of why this has been so marginalized within popular memory, within the state identity, et cetera.
I think there are multiple reasons for this. First of all, after all, Know Nothing movement didn't last long, and it's being considered a relatively minor part of American political history. So politically speaking, yes, the Know Nothings didn't leave much accomplishment, except that it definitely helped the formation of the Republican Party, which is big. But in terms of their nativist achievements, they failed their major proposal, that is extension of waiting period for naturalization from 5 years to 21 years. So they failed their major national platform. So the historians kind of lost interest in know not things beyond some of the political context for a long time, right? And it also at the both scholarly and popular levels, stories of immigration, especially Massachusetts, tended to be kind of really progressive. That is how immigrants came and how immigrants developed communities, and then how immigrants assimilated into American culture. And it was especially the case for European immigrants, right?
A more uplifting story, right?
It's classic, yes, American story, uplifting story. We came, we worked hard, we overcame difficulties, and then we became part of American society. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this, but then in that process, the story of deportation or early immigration restriction became lost, and also battery exhausted.
I'll be yeah, because I tried to. Sorry, give me 1 sec. Continue on. I'm just which camera.
And also historians' interests have played some role in this. The loss of deportation topic, the loss of these particular aspects of immigration policy history. So when historians became interested in the issues of immigration policy, Asian Americanists, right? I mean, those interested in Asian migration became the first group. Again, there's nothing wrong with this, and this was really a natural consequence given the importance of Chinese exclusion, right? So immigration restriction has long been really one of the central themes in Asian American history, Asian American studies. So a lot of people have focused on exclusion experiences of Chinese, Japanese, Indians, and also later in the mid-20th century, Mexican experiences became really central. Again, there's nothing wrong with this, but I'm just just explaining why earlier parts, failed to capture historians and public attention. And I think part of the reason was this, right? Precisely because of the centrality of racism in the history of American immigration policy, earlier parts, which were about Europeans, were, I think, lost. And then as a result, we have what one scholar calls the open borders myth before 1875.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I have one more question for you, but before I do, I want to make sure that that the students have a chance if they've been waiting for their moment. Do anybody have any questions for Professor Hirota before I ask my last one? Well, mine involves a prop. So hold on a second.
Hey, I'm up at after 11:30, so you can reward my commitment with your questions.
That's right. That's right. Please do it. That's exactly. It's almost midnight for the poor gentleman. Does anybody have any questions? I think today election day is I think also like I said earlier before we got started, I've been told to be very sympathetic and and sensitive and understand they're all very distracted. So, but I know that they they definitely have. Alexander says in the chat that election day is wearing everyone out, but for all of that, almost every student, looking at the participants, almost every student got up at 8 a.m. still and joined our class to listen in. So I'm really, really happy about that. Of course, I expect you all to do it, but
I can,
yeah,
I understand, people's feelings today, and I can just fill in,
yeah.
especially, I guess, you're interested in, the present moment, right? I mean, you're interested in making sense of, I guess Trumpism. What's unique about Trump administration in the history of American immigration policy, for example. Assuming that you're interested in this topic, I can just quickly say what's unique about today, the current situation, is that simply the president is leading the anti-immigrant movement. This is actually unique because normally presidents were the people who oppose those restrictive and hostile approaches to immigration or immigrants. There were so many federal immigration laws, over the course, since the 1880s, and whenever Congress passed a new immigration law, president tended to veto those bills for economic reasons or ethical, moral reasons, or out of concern about America's international image, right? How the international communities would think about America. Those concerns led earlier presidents to veto those immigration bills, and then Congress overcame those vetoes to make those laws. That's the kind of pattern. But then the current administration really doesn't quite fit into this pattern, and for the obvious reasons, right? So the president is really leading, the whole movement. That's actually historical reality. I think it's a rare phenomenon.
That's really a fascinating point, and I guess today, we are at the moment of a fulcrum of whether or not this is something that is going to be reversed or rejected, or maybe reinforced. But ironically, it probably, if it's rejected, if we switch courses, it won't have to do with immigration per se, right? But rather other issues.
Mhm.
But we have a whole bunch of questions. Of course, with 4 minutes left, now the students are asking questions.
Hey, we got a question here.
Yeah, a couple of questions here. Well, since you have it, I'll let you read them. But
Was America's trendsetter for other nations of the world in 19th century in terms of their anti-immigrant policy sentiment? More or less, yes, but it's a little difficult because immigration control itself was nothing new, right? Like Europe, for example, many European states had developed policies for regulating the internal movement of people, movement within Europe, right? So the Poor Law, for example, the Poor Law was a form of immigration. It was a policy, controlling the domestic movement of people, and also, in kind of international or interstate movement within Europe was definitely exercised. So in that sense, there were precedents definitely for immigration control before the U.S. developed those laws in the 19th century. But there were many countries that followed America's models. So in that sense, trendsetter. I guess the question is yes and no. All right. Let me just move on.
Of course, now they're coming in many questions. Well, I appreciate these questions. They're all quite.
I'm thinking three.
So Anna has asked why many nativists supported abolitionism but discriminated against immigrants. And Noah asked about anti-American whether there's anti-American sentiment in Ireland, and what Irish perspective is of the United States. I mean, these are fantastic questions.
Both are great questions. Just to respond to Anna first. Yeah, so there are lots of explanations about this, but racism and economics matter a lot, in many ways. So natives thought that, the nativist abolitionists, anti-slavery nativists, they sympathized with blacks, like slaves, in a sense that, like slavery was very brutal. Blacks should be saved from this, cruel treatments. And yes, they were driven by um, uh, sense of justice, but at the same time, some sort of racial condescension, right? But that's one side. And then on the other hand, the native abolitionists thought that the poor Irish, were really kind of, they were shameful. They were white people, so they were supposed to be more decent, right? They were supposed to behave better. They should have done, better, precisely because they were white. So this kind of sentiment made abolitionist nativists attitude toward the Irish really severe and even harsher.
They
than
also argued that the Irish would support slavery, right?
That's exactly the same. Yeah, that's the point. So many of the Irish ended up going with a Democratic Party, which really advocated white supremacy as a kind of party's organizing tool, right? Like, white supremacy was an organizing factor for Democrats. And then many Irish opposed abolitionism. So that really, made the Anglo-Bostonians' impression about Irish really, bad.
We have to, I hate to interrupt, we have to save Noah's question for discussion sections on Friday. It's a very good point for us to talk about on Friday in our discussion questions, because otherwise I won't have time. I am already out of time, but I won't have be able to use my extra minute to give the trivia question and also to share my prop. So I'll share my prop first, which was going to be a question, but now I'll just make a point. The point being that the great irony here is, of course, Boston is not primarily thought of as a Puritan city anymore, right? Its major identity is Irish, right? I mean, the Irish won, of course, in terms of the cultural imprint on the city, to the extent that in my neighborhood, which is almost entirely Irish in West Roxbury, as you know, my kids play hockey. And this is my daughter's helmet. She plays for the Parkway Hawks. The symbol is not like many of the teams, like Southie has a shamrock, it's Irish, but every kid on her team wears this shamrock. I mean, the identity of the neighborhood is still so linked to Ireland that all the kids, whether Irish or not, still wear the shamrock on their helmet because it's so connected to the identity. So the Irish won in the end, I think, at least in terms of the identity of the city. Now the question, and I'll post it for those who have to run to another class, but is as follows: how much was the bond a ship captain had to provide per passenger who was considered likely to become a public charge, according to the 1848 Massachusetts passenger law? And the second part is, approximately how much would that be in U.S. currency today? So I'll post it on Canvas so people can read it again and think about it and do some research. But that is the question for this fantastic mug right here. And I apologize, Professor Hirota, that it may take a while to get to Japan. In a perfect world, I would hand deliver it, or wait for you to come to Boston. But I will put it by mail. So thank you so much. It was so wonderful, and our thank yous are rolling in the chats. This is my favorite part. All of my wonderful, polite students give very nice thank yous in the chat.
Thank you.
Was really great. And students, have the good rest of your day. Do some yoga. It's a beautiful day, I think. I haven't been out yet, but it looks like a beautiful day. Go for a nice walk, breathe deep, and I assure you, everything is going to be okay. All right. They don't believe
Yes,
me, but that's
I
fine.
second. Yes. Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Have a
Take care,
wonderful day.
Hide. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank
Take care.
you.
Bye.
Bye.